a pleasure and especially an honor to be here, not just because of my involvement in food safety, but because of my long-term relationship with SAFE, as you pointed out. The title of my presentation, as it was given, The Importance of Food Safety. Do we really need to prove the importance of food safety? Well, for scientists, professionals, researchers, I guess no. It's obvious, isn't it? Do we need to prove it for the industry? I believe not. They are spending enormous amount of money for different tools. Do we need to prove it for the legislator? I believe not anymore. We do have strict legislation. Do we need to prove it to the retail sector or any other parts of the food chain? Maybe, yes, for the SMEs. Do we need to prove it for the consumers? Yes and no. Consumers are fully aware of the importance of food safety. And sometimes they are just too much hysterized and alerted by the media, aren't they? But still, consumers still need to be educated. So it's difficult to respond to this first question. Do we need to explain the importance of food safety? I'm sure that the response is much more a yes. Why? Because if consumers are much more worried about the pesticide residues than about the mycotoxins, and they don't understand the difference in between risks, then yes, we do need to give further explanations. So to prove, to explain, and do we need to improve food safety? Some might say no, because we do have the safest food in Europe, don't we? But yes, on the other hand, there is always room for improvement. The importance of food safety and food safety as a topic of discussion is there for the last more than 20 years. For the last quarter of a century, since we had the real first big scandal, the BSE. There were a series of food safety related scandals in Europe. But still, I prefer to call them food crises, not necessarily food safety crises or scandals. Why? Because some of them are really related to food safety, but very often, if there are quality concerns, if there are problems in the food chain related to traceability, consumers still think about safety. They still feel that their health is endangered in a way. Is food safety any better than in the 80s and in the 90s in Europe? Yes, I do believe. The level of food safety is higher. But still, we do have series of food crises, don't we? That time when we had BSE and dioxin crisis, there was no risk analysis framework in place. There was no proper scientific risk assessment done. EFSA didn't exist. National food safety authorities didn't exist. The legislation was rather different. There was no traceability system in place. Not to mention the third element of the risk analysis framework, risk communication. There was no proper risk communication. And whatever decision was made by the decision makers, by the legislators, the so-called risk managers, at least those whom we would call risk managers these days, their decisions were not necessarily based on scientific information, on the outcome of the scientific risk assessment. And still, several other food crises happened. Well, the melamine, of course, didn't originate in Europe, but it just shows the globalization and its effects. And why I put one of the next one in quotation mark, because at the beginning, even some of the international organizations called it in a wrong way making a good basis for misperception by the consumers. Then a real big one, the E. coli outbreak. But that time, we already had a risk assessment, a scientific risk assessment, and a risk analysis framework in place. And the recent one. I think, if not the E. coli being the best case study for a university professor, then the horse meat scandal is definitely a very good example to show that whenever consumers believe that there are food safety related issues, it just might simply not be a food safety case. But for the consumer, it doesn't matter. There was a fraud, there was something went wrong, the traceability system didn't work. Whenever it is an adulteration of the food, even if it's not a safety, but a quality problem or an ethical issue, for the consumer, it always seems to be a safety issue. So, what kind of message can be sent to the consumer? The food what we have and the food what is produced and marketed in Europe is amongst the safest ones in the world, isn't it? The level of food hygiene, the level of food safety is much higher than it used to be. We do have tools applied by the industry for production. We do have a strict legislation. We do have a risk analysis framework. We have high level of scientific risk assessment done by EFSA and by the national food safety authorities. And still, consumers in Europe do believe that their daily food is not safe. Is there any room for improvement throughout the food chain? Oh yes, I'm sure there is always room for improvement. But if there is a gray zone, isn't it the consumer itself, at the end of the chain, the household? We are all aware that most of the foodborne diseases are originated in the household. So still, there is a lot to be done. Does it cost money? Oh yes, it costs a lot. And it is a general public health issue. Even in Europe, where we live in the luckiest part of the world, probably, there are many cases. The number is much lower, of course, than in any other part of the world. But still, every case is a case, especially when it's a death. Besides being a public health issue and the burden on the healthcare systems, there is a loss of productivity, there is a huge amount of waste, and finally, a huge economical impact on the whole sector. It's extremely difficult to value the loss. How much does it cost for the different stakeholders, for the healthcare system? There are different figures in the literature, but how reliable they are and whether we have a full picture, that's a different issue. As I said, food has never been safer than these days. And I think the different players of the food chain may be up to a different level, but have enormous efforts and spend enormous amount of money to make sure that the food what is produced and marketed is safe. The level of safety differs, of course. Some believe in the local market, some believe in supermarkets. So whatever choice you have, still the food what is available in Europe is much safer than earlier and much safer than anywhere else. Is there anything else to be done? So, as Begonia said, do we need to keep this issue high on the European agenda? Oh yes, still. And not only because consumers are worried about the safety of their food. As you know, and there are many different statistics, consumer science is exploring, and Eurobarometer had several different studies showing that consumers are very much worried about the safety of their foods. Are these only the consumers' worries, or is there a real problem? Why is that still most of the European consumers, almost half of them, are worried about the safety of their daily food? Is it only communication, education, what we need to do? Or is there a need for further research? Do we have what is needed? Yes, definitely. But you can always further improve risk assessment. We don't always have sufficient data for risk assessors, so the output cannot be perfect. Can we further improve our technologies to make sure that there is safe food provided? We extend the shelf life, we ensure safety, and still it's a wholesome and nutritious and tasty food for the consumer? Yes. Can we further optimize, besides the technologies, the products, the packaging? Definitely. Is there a room for further research? Is there a need for further education in this area? Yes, always. As there was the acrylamide issue mentioned in one of the slides, could we face any day a similar issue with any of the genotoxic carcinogens or endocrine disruptors or whatever comes up? Yes, any day it might happen. Can we be prepared for those? There are different international organizations, including WHO, FAO, EFSA, trying to focus on emerging risks. Is it possible to be fully prepared? Probably not. But you do need to invest into research constantly to make sure that if anything happens, then you are ready to react. Enormous amount of money spent in Europe on research, food-related research. I didn't find a figure on the money spent, especially on food safety-related issues. But under the existing or previous framework programs, it was one of the priorities. Should this be kept on the table? Should this be a priority for the future? I'm sure that the response is yes. As I showed on the previous slides, there are many different organizations, associations dealing with food safety-related issues. Have we harmonized our work sufficiently? Maybe not yet. Is there a room for further cooperation? I'm sure there is. ILSI Europe, the International Life Science Institute, for which I'm the scientific and executive director, is an organization which tries to bring together scientists from industry, from academia, and the public sector. And that is an added value. But the same people are sitting in different committees of different organizations and trying to find out where are the gaps in research. I picked up a few issues, mainly from the strategic research and innovation agenda of the ETP Food for Life, for which the SAFE consortium provided enormous input, as I remember, Harman yourself in the field of food safety, and from WHO. Just a few areas mentioned in these strategic documents in the field of risk analysis, and then I will show a few more, which should be on the top of the agenda in terms of food safety related research, biomarkers, margin of exposure, threshold of toxicological concern, predictive models, risk-benefit assessment, risk communication, and so on, so on. The blue ones are where Europe is active. In the field of microbiological hazards, again, the source was the same, mainly the scientific research innovation agenda of ETP, Food for Life, pathogens, their persistence, antibiotic resistance, foodborne viruses, etc., etc. There are many hot topics regarding chemical hazards, again. And let me just refer back what I said at the beginning, that for the consumer, food safety is a global issue. For the consumer, chemical hazards might be much more important than the microbiological ones. And we haven't succeeded for, I might say, for decades to convince the consumers that the microbiology-related hazards can be much more important than any others. So do we need to prove, if I may come back to my original question, the importance of food safety? Definitely not for the researchers, not for the scientists, not for the professionals, and maybe not for some of the international organizations which are fully aware of the importance of food safety. But do we need to prove the importance of food safety for the decision makers, for those who will set up future goals in Europe within the next framework program, or those who will decide upon the future research agenda in general in Europe? Yes, maybe we do. We do need to do that. How to do it? I sincerely hope that your vision paper, prepared in the last few months to be introduced today, will be one way of doing so. Is there anything else to be done? Definitely. And if we just think about those elements I mentioned earlier, which were missing 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago, when we had the first few food scandals, then one can see that enormous efforts were done in Europe in terms of research, policy making, legislation. Theoretically, we do have the framework. We do have the knowledge. Whether the legislation is implemented properly or not, that's another issue. Whether there is room for further improvement, well, most probably yes. Is there anything else what we can do besides making sure that your vision paper, the message, will come across, that each of us would be able to convince the decision makers about the importance of food safety? Oh yes, I'm sure that there is much more what needs to be done. Thank you very much for your attention.